Welcome to Terminal Services. My name is Michael Crowd. I'm with Idea Dudes. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them at the bottom of the video. Let's get started. Planning terminal services infrastructure is the thing that we're going to be looking at in this module. Now, there's a product out there called Citrix, and Citrix requires that you have terminal services. You have to have the terminal services licensing plus the application licensing. I mean, it can just become a whole big giant sized ball of wax. So with terminal services, what we can do is lower our total cost of ownership because we don't need Citrix. Now the thing is we need to look at the hardware because that's going to be one of the determining factors of how your terminal services environment is going to react. Also looking at the software because there's certain applications that may not be available that can run on terminal services. Also the licensing. Licensing is one of the main parts because you have to have a license for the application, and you have to have a license for the terminal server, and keeping track of those licenses is very important. We'll also be looking at the terminal services CAL, which is the client access licenses. So you have the licenses for the application, then the licenses for the terminal server, and the licenses for the client access. And so we can do either per device or per user. So we'll be looking at the different versions of the licensing for terminal server. And then also looking at configuring the different services available with terminal services. Because we have TS Gateway, TS Remote App, TS Web Access. We have all these different services that are involved with terminal server. So we're going to be looking at all these. So planning remote desktop infrastructure provides a remotely accessible desktop to the client. And so that's what terminal services is. It allows us to be able to provide an infrastructure where a client doesn't even need a very powerful desktop because everything is running on the server. Now Microsoft is changing the name over to Remote Desktop, and that's for Windows 2008 R2. So make sure you check out our videos on R2 later on. Now when we look at terminal services, this is also creating what's known as a thin client. A thin client just means that the processing is done on the server. We have a low-powered machine that's right in front of us, and we just access either the desktop or the application through the thin client software, which is going to be terminal server. Now, what are the benefits of implementing terminal services? Well, users' workstations can have a minimum amount of software, run a minimum amount of software. All they have is they'll have a base operating system, and then they can run everything else from there. All they need to do is be able to access a web access, TS web access, or they can also have it where it's streamed right to their desktop using Microsoft application virtualization. Now, user data is always stored in a central location. That's one of the other benefits. Because one of the things is if everybody keeps their information on their desktop or on their laptop crashes, they lose that information. If we have it in a central point, then we have the ability of going and backing it up. Anti-spyware and antivirus, we don't have to worry about that. We have it centrally managed on the actual terminal server. So when a client connects, even if they're connecting through the internet through our terminal services access for a virtual desktop, for example, they'll still have or be protected by the antivirus and anti-spyware that we have on the server. And application updates are centrally managed. So if I want to go and update an application, all I have to do is on the terminal server. I don't have to walk around to each of the different desktops. This is going to lower our total cost of ownership. So let's look at planning. We need to look at high bandwidth, providing us with low latency. Low latency means that things that have been changed, if we have it not available for a long time, then we'll have latency. So we'll have low latency if we have high bandwidth. Clients expect a certain level of responsiveness from the applications. Well, we have enough resources, memory, disk space, and also network bandwidth. These are going to help us to be able to provide the clients with what they were looking for. Better bandwidth between the client and the terminal services, the better the overall experience for the client. Consider deploying on each of the branch office sites. That way they don't have to go across the WAN. Because if they have to go across the WAN to another terminal server, then that's going to slow things down. Look at the number of clients that will connect, and you need to gauge how many clients. So what you'll do is you'll create a baseline. The baseline is showing us, hey, this is under normal conditions. Then we can compare the actual results of our monitoring to the baseline to find our bottlenecks. So planning terminal server hardware, you need powerful processors, quad cores. They're actually coming out with a 16 core. So whatever we can give to the terminal server, that's what we want to do. Lots of RAM, because these are RAM intensive programs. So you need to look at each of the different desktops, how much RAM is it taking for those users, and then you need to multiply it so that way you can get enough RAM on the actual terminal server itself. x64 versions of Enterprise and Data Center are the ones that you want to use because they provide the most RAM that we can get. Terminal services farms also, because what we want to do is want to provide a redundancy, so a failover and also a load balancing, because what we can do is we can implement a TS session broker which will allow us to be able to balance the load. And that's one of the things that we were missing on terminal services in Windows 2003. So we still had to use Citrix. Citrix has a load balancer, but now we have it within terminal services. So again, this is going to help you to lower your total cost of ownership. Now, thinking about virtualizing, it's not a good idea unless you have a small amount of users. Because remember, you got to have a very powerful machine out there that is going to be able to support all those virtual images. The Windows System Resource Manager is going to be one of the utilities that's going to allow you to be able to limit the amount of resources, and Performance Monitor allow us to be able to see the baselines. And we need to gauge how many clients are connected, because that's going to be how we're going to make a determination on RAM, network bandwidth, and so forth. The software needs to be installed after the terminal server. So what you'll do is you install the terminal server, then you install the software. And what you do is you put it in install mode, and then you switch into execute mode after you've done with the software. Now this is done automatically if you use add and remove programs, but if you do it from the command prompt, then what you have to do is you have to use the command switches along with it. You need to plan a testing period. Testing is very important, because if you don't test, then you won't know what are the different things that you can run into. And so what happens is you start to run and chase yourself on fire. So what you want to do is put those fires out in the very beginning by testing, so you know which ones they are that are going to pop up. Look at groups into application groups. You need to take and put everybody who is associated with the different application, put it into a group instead of doing it by individuals. It's going to make it easier for troubleshooting. And test the software as if it was on a day-to-day basis. Because what you want to do is you want to get an overall feel of what the client is going to go through when they're actually using their application through a terminal services environment. Then the licensing is, we have the TS-CAL, which is the client access license. And what this does is allows the individual to be able to connect through a remote desktop. It's not included with the client operating system. You have to actually purchase these. These are going to be from the licensing warehouse or the Microsoft clearinghouse. And so when you activate the terminal services licensing server, you'll connect, and you have to activate that licensing server. Now you'll have 180 days that you'll be able to use the terminal services before it will not allow any clients to connect again. So what you need to do is purchase your licenses and activate them on the server. So what are some of the licensing decisions that you need to make? Well, you need to look at what is the scope of the license server. Is it going to be a domain, or is it going to be on a forest? How will a license server be activated? Will it be on a phone, on the web, or automatically? How many license servers are required? That's going to be determined on the amount of clients. You need to look at how many clients you have in your organization and what type of licenses will be deployed. These are all very important decisions that you're going to make. We're going to be looking at backing up and restoring a license server. Now this is one of the things that you need to do, because if the terminal services licensing server goes down, then we need to be able to restore these licenses, or we'll have to contact Microsoft and find our licenses again. So we need to back them up. The way we do this is we're going to back up the system state. The system state includes all of the different things like COM plus your terminal services licensing. Also the folder where the database is stored. You also need to review the configuration to find this information. That's where you're going to be able to look, and it'll show you exactly where the folder is that the database is stored. To restore, you need to rebuild a server, reinstall the TS licensing server role, restore the system state data, then restore the licensing database. Now, if you can't put it on the same server, then what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to call Microsoft to reissue the licenses. So those are the different things that you have to do with the licensing on terminal server. So looking at licensing server deployment, one of the things that we have to keep in mind that Windows 2003 and 2000 cannot issue licenses to 2008. But Windows Server 2008 can give the licenses, so it provides backwards compatibility. So if you have a coexistence, you need to upgrade the remote desktop licensing server or terminal services licensing. So configuring remote desktop, there's different settings that we do have. Now you can configure this on the user, you can also configure this on the client, but what we usually should do is do it on the protocol level, which is going to be RDP TCP. The next thing we're going to talk about is TS Session Broker. Now TS Session Broker is used for when you're going to be implementing a terminal server farm. And a terminal server farm is going to allow us to be able to load balance the actual traffic within our environment. So it's a role service that we do implement when you implement a terminal server. Enables a user to reconnect to an existing session and also load balance a farm. Now what it does is it looks at if you already have a connection, then it will reconnect to the same one. If it doesn't have a connection, then it's going to reissue a connection. Also, the TS Session Broker load balancing feature distributes the load among the terminal server farm members. So each member is going to be given a certain amount of traffic, and it's going to be based, you can also base it on which one is going to be the beefiest server, the one with the most RAM, the most hard drive, the one that's going to be able to process the most. So the TS Session Broker new functionality enables you to evenly distribute the session load between the servers, and new sessions are redirected to the terminal server with the least sessions. Let's take a look at the actual connections. So the first phase of the connection is the initial connections are distributed using DNS round robin or NLB. DNS round robin just uses the same host address with different IP addresses. Now network load balancing does a little bit different. What it does is it checks the heartbeat of the server. If the heartbeat of the server is not available, then it's going to be able to switch over between 2 and 3 seconds. Now the user authenticates, and then the TS terminal server queries the TS Session Broker to determine where to reconnect. So the second part of the phase is the terminal server redirects the user to the terminal server identified by the TS Session Broker, because what it has is a database showing what are the different connections that we do have. Now again, redirection, existing session will connect to the server where they exist. And if they don't have a connection, then what it's going to do is create a new session. And remember, if we have a disconnected session, what it does is it's going to take up resources. So it's best to disconnect. And well, when they do disconnect, you should release those resources. That way they're available for other clients. So when we look at TS session load balancing, the limits of 16 maximum number of pending logon requests to a particular terminal server. So that means our backup queue. If it's more than that, then we're going to have an issue. So it helps prevent a server from being overwhelmed. The weight can be assigned to the server, and this means that they have better processing, they have more resources available for the clients. It helps distribute the load to a more powerful server. So what are the TS Session Broker requirements? Well, you need RDP 5.2 or later on the clients, and all terminal services must run Windows Server 2008. So, in recap, the TS license server must be activated before installing TS cows. Discovery Scope determines which clients and TS server can automatically detect a server. So is it going to be domain? Is it going to be forest? The TS Session Broker allows you to create a terminal server farm. And DNS Round Robin or NLB can be paired with the TS Session Broker. And this ensures that disconnected sessions are always reconnected to correct session on the appropriate server. This is based on the database that's kept with the TS Session Broker. TS Web Access allows clients to connect to terminal server through a web client. Now, if you're going to be using TS Web Access with TS Remote app, you won't be able to use a terminal server farm. TS Gateway allows clients from the internet to connect to terminal services without a VPN. All we have to do is open up port 80 or 443. TS CALs are going to be managed and purchased. You need to look at the discovery scope and the exam question. That is what our exam alert is for this module. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the GoGo box at the bottom of the video. Thanks for joining us.